March 3rd, 1894, a cramped office on Chancery Lane, where the walls were lined with legal volumes that had not been opened in years, and the single window looked out onto a narrow alley that never saw direct sunlight. The desk was cluttered with papers, inkwells, and a half-eaten sandwich that had been forgotten since the previous afternoon. Thomas Ashworth sat behind that desk, 26 years old, recently qualified, and already exhausted by the weight of what he had discovered. The ledger lay open before him. It was bound in green leather, embossed with gold lettering that read Harland & Sons Private Banking, and it contained entries going back 18 months. Thomas had been asked to review these records as part of a routine audit, a task assigned to junior solicitors because senior partners considered it beneath their attention. He had expected to find nothing more than columns of numbers, dates, transfers, and the ordinary movements of money between wealthy clients and their various investments. What he found instead was a pattern. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as clerical error or unusual but legitimate transactions. But the more Thomas traced the numbers, the more he understood that something was deeply wrong. Funds had been moved from client accounts into holding companies that existed only on paper. Those holding companies had then transferred money to other accounts that bore no names Thomas recognized from the bank's official records. The amounts were not enormous, not enough to trigger immediate alarm, but they were consistent. Every month, without fail, money disappeared. Thomas pushed his spectacles up his nose and leaned closer to the page. His eyes ached from hours of reading by candlelight, and his back hurt from sitting in a chair that was slightly too low for the desk. But he could not stop. The pattern had become an obsession, a puzzle that demanded solving. He had filled 3 notebooks with his observations, cross-referencing dates and amounts, tracing the flow of money through a maze of transactions that seemed designed to confuse anyone who tried to follow them. The door to his office opened without a knock. Thomas looked up to find Henry Blackwood standing in the doorway. His senior partner, a man of 53, with grey whiskers and a permanent expression of mild disappointment. Blackwood was holding a letter in his hand, and his face was pale. "You've been summoned," Blackwood said. His voice was flat, carefully neutral, the voice of a man who had learned long ago not to betray his emotions. "Harland House. Tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "Summoned by whom?" "Theodore Harland himself." Blackwood stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. He looked at the ledger on Thomas's desk, then at the notebooks, then at Thomas. "What have you been doing?" "My job," Thomas said. "I was asked to review the accounts." "You were asked to verify that the accounts were in order, not to conduct an investigation." Blackwood's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now, a warning. "The Harland family has been a client of this firm for 40 years. They are not ordinary clients. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Thomas understood perfectly. The Harlands were one of the wealthiest families in England, their banking empire touching every corner of commerce and industry. Their money built railways and factories, funded politicians and philanthropies, shaped the very landscape of modern Britain. To question their accounts was to question power itself, and Thomas, a junior solicitor from a family of modest means, had no business asking such questions. "I found irregularities," Thomas said quietly. "Significant ones. Money has been moved without proper authorization, transferred to accounts that do not appear in official records. Someone has been—" "Stop!" Blackwood held up his hand. "I do not want to hear this, and neither does anyone else. You will attend the meeting tomorrow. You will answer whatever questions you are asked, and then you will close this ledger and never open it again." He paused, and for a moment his mask slipped, revealing something that might have been fear or might have been pity. "Theodore Harland is not a man you want as an enemy, Thomas. Trust me on this." After Blackwood left, Thomas sat alone in his office for a long time. The candle burned low, casting shadows that danced across the walls like living things. He thought about his mother, who had worked as a seamstress to pay for his education. He thought about his father, who had died when Thomas was 12, leaving behind nothing but debts and a collection of books that Thomas still kept on a shelf in his rented room. He thought about all the years of study and sacrifice that had brought him to this moment, to this desk, to this choice. He could do as Blackwood advised. Close the ledger, forget what he had seen, build a career on the foundation of strategic blindness, as so many others had done before him. The Harlands would continue their operations, whatever those operations were. The money would continue to flow through its hidden channels, and Thomas would continue his ordinary life, climbing slowly through the ranks of the legal profession until he retired to a modest house in the country and died having accomplished nothing of particular significance. Or he could keep digging. He could follow the money to its source, uncover whatever truth lay hidden beneath the Harland fortune, and face the consequences of that discovery. It was a romantic notion, the kind of thing that happened in novels, not in real life. Real life had taught Thomas that people who challenged powerful families did not become heroes. They became cautionary tales, whispered about in private clubs as examples of what happened to those who forgot their place. Thomas closed the ledger. He blew out the candle. He put on his coat and hat and walked out into the cold March evening, his breath forming clouds in the air. The streets of London were busy with carriages and pedestrians, the city alive with the ordinary business of living. Thomas walked among them, invisible, unremarkable, a young man carrying a secret that could destroy one of the most powerful families in England. He did not sleep that night. The house stood at the end of a private drive in Mayfair, surrounded by gardens that were maintained by a staff of 12. It was built of pale stone that gleamed in the morning light, with tall windows that reflected the sky, and a front door painted the deep red of dried blood. Thomas had passed this house many times during his years in London, but he had never stood before it, never approached its entrance, never imagined that he would be summoned inside by the family who owned it. A butler answered his knock, an elderly man with a face that revealed nothing. He examined Thomas's card, then nodded and stepped aside, allowing Thomas to enter a hallway that was larger than the entire ground floor of the building where Thomas rented his room. The floor was marble, white with grey veins, polished to a mirror shine. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of Harland ancestors stretching back generations, their eyes following Thomas as he walked past. The butler led him up a curved staircase to the first floor, then down a corridor lined with closed doors. At the end of the corridor was a door that stood open, revealing a study filled with morning light. The butler gestured for Thomas to enter, then withdrew without a word, his footsteps making no sound on the carpet. Theodore Harland was standing by the window, his back to the door. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with broad shoulders and dark hair that was just beginning to show grey at the temples. He was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Thomas earned in a year, cut perfectly to his frame, without a single crease or wrinkle. He did not turn when Thomas entered. "Close the door," he said. Thomas closed it. The sound of the latch clicking into place seemed very loud in the silence that followed. "You have been reviewing our accounts." It was not a question. Theodore's voice was smooth, cultured, the voice of a man who had been educated at the finest schools and had never in his life had to raise it to be heard. "You have been making notes, filling notebooks with your observations. You have been asking questions of the clerks at our bank, questions about transactions that are none of your concern." Thomas said nothing. He had prepared himself for this moment, had rehearsed in his mind what he would say and how he would say it. But standing here, in this room, facing this man, all his preparations seemed suddenly inadequate. Theodore Harland radiated power, the way a furnace radiates heat, an invisible force that filled the space around him and made it difficult to breathe. Theodore turned from the window. His face was handsome, in a sharp, angular way, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw and eyes that were the pale blue of winter ice. Those eyes, fixed on Thomas now, studying him, measuring him, taking his exact dimensions. "You found something," Theodore said. "Something that disturbed you. Something you believe to be evidence of wrongdoing." He walked slowly toward Thomas, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "Tell me what you found." Thomas swallowed. His throat was dry, his heart beating fast. "I found transfers," he said. "Money moved from client accounts to holding companies. The holding companies then transferred funds to other accounts, accounts not listed in your official records. The pattern has been consistent for at least 18 months, possibly longer." Theodore nodded slowly. "And what conclusions have you drawn from these observations?" "I haven't drawn any conclusions." Thomas forced himself to meet Theodore's gaze. I have documented the irregularities. That is my duty as a solicitor conducting an audit. It is not my place to make accusations. But you have suspicions. Theodore stopped walking. He was standing very close now, close enough that Thomas could smell his cologne, something expensive and faintly floral. You suspect that someone within my bank has been stealing money. Perhaps you suspect that someone is me. The silence stretched between them like a wire, pulled tight. Thomas could hear his own breathing, could feel his pulse in his temples. He understood now why Blackwood had warned him, why the senior partner's face had been so pale. Theodore Harland was not merely wealthy. He was dangerous in a way that Thomas had never encountered before, dangerous in the way of a man who had never been told no, who had never faced a consequence he could not buy or threaten or charm his way out of. The evidence, Thomas said carefully, suggests that the transfers were authorized by someone with access to the highest levels of the bank's operations. Whether that person was acting alone or with the knowledge of others, I cannot say. Theodore smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It did not reach his eyes, which remained as cold and pale as before. You are being diplomatic, he said. That is wise. Diplomacy is a valuable skill, particularly for a young solicitor with no family connections and no fortune to fall back upon. He turned away, walking toward a desk that stood near the window. I have made inquiries about you, Thomas Ashworth. I know where you live. I know where your mother lives. I know that you have debts, modest ones, but debts nonetheless. I know that your career depends entirely upon the good opinion of men like Henry Blackwood, men who depend in turn upon the patronage of families like mine. He sat down behind the desk and opened a drawer. From it, he withdrew a wooden box, which he placed on the desktop. He opened the box, revealing a stack of banknotes bound with a paper band. £500, Theodore said. More than you earn in 2 years. Enough to pay off your debts, move your mother to a better neighborhood, establish yourself in a practice of your own if you wish. All you need to do is close your notebooks, destroy your notes, and report to your firm that the Harland accounts are in perfect order. Thomas stared at the money. £500. It was more than he had ever seen in one place, more than he had ever imagined holding in his hands. He thought of his mother's cold room, the draught that came through the window she could not afford to repair. He thought of his own rented room, the thin walls, the neighbor who coughed all night with a sickness that would probably kill him before spring. £500 could change everything. And if I refuse? Thomas heard himself ask. Theodore's smile widened. Then I will destroy you. Not physically, of course. That would be crude. But I will ensure that you never work as a solicitor again. I will ensure that every door in London closes to you. I will ensure that your mother spends her remaining years in a workhouse and that you spend yours in a debtor's prison, and that everyone who ever knew you will forget your name within a generation. He said this calmly, without heat, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of tea. I do not make threats, Mr. Ashworth. I make promises, and I always keep my promises. Thomas looked at Theodore Harland, at his handsome face and his cold eyes and his perfect suit, and he understood something that he had not understood before. This was not merely a wealthy man protecting his fortune. This was something else, something deeper and more disturbing. There was a hunger in Theodore's eyes, a need that had nothing to do with money. He needed Thomas to submit. He needed to see Thomas break. I will need time to consider, Thomas said. You have until Friday. Theodore closed the box and returned it to the drawer. When you have made your decision, send word to my secretary. She will arrange another meeting. He stood and walked toward the door, opening it to reveal the silent butler waiting outside. Good day, Mr. Ashworth. I trust you can find your own way out. Thomas walked down the corridor, down the curved staircase, across the marble floor, and out through the blood-red door. The cold, March air hit his face like a slap. He stood on the steps of Harland House looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens, and he understood that his life would never be the same. He'd been given a choice between his integrity and his survival, and he did not know which one he would choose. Eleanor Whitmore had worked in Harland House for 7 years. She had begun as a chambermaid at the age of 16, recommended by her aunt who worked in the kitchens, and had risen through the ranks to become a parlour-maid, trusted with the dusting of valuable objects and the serving of tea to important guests. She was 23 now, plain-featured but neat, with brown hair that she kept pinned beneath her cap and hands that were always clean despite the endless work. She had learned early that the key to survival in service was invisibility. The best servants were those who could move through rooms without being noticed, who could anticipate needs without being asked, who could see everything and reveal nothing. Eleanor had perfected this art. She knew how to lower her eyes at the right moment, how to step back into shadows, how to make herself so small and silent that the family forgot she was there. This was how she had learned Theodore Harland's secrets. She had not intended to learn them. She had not wanted to know. But when you spent 7 years moving through a house, dusting shelves and emptying grates and laying fires, you saw things, you heard things, you noticed patterns that others missed because they were too busy with their own concerns to pay attention to the details of daily life. The first thing Eleanor had noticed was the way Theodore looked at people. Not at servants, of course. Servants were beneath his notice, as invisible to him as the furniture. But when he looked at guests, at business associates, at members of his own family, there was something wrong in his eyes, something cold and calculating, as if he were measuring them for a coffin. Eleanor had seen that look on the faces of cats watching mice, and it made her stomach tight with fear. The second thing she had noticed was the locked room on the 3rd floor. Every room in Harland House was cleaned by the maids, every room except one. The room at the end of the eastern corridor was always locked, and Theodore carried the only key on a chain around his neck. The housekeeper had explained years ago that the room contained Mr. Harland's private papers and was not to be disturbed. Eleanor had accepted this explanation at the time. But she had noticed that Theodore visited that room every night, sometimes staying for hours, and that he always emerged looking different, calmer, satisfied, as if some hunger had been fed. The third thing Eleanor had noticed was the visitors who came to the house after dark. They arrived in unmarked carriages, their faces hidden beneath hats and scarves, and they were always shown directly to Theodore's study. Eleanor had served them on several occasions, bringing tea that was never drunk and cakes that were never eaten. The men spoke in low voices, using words that Eleanor did not understand, words that sounded like codes or signals, and Theodore always paid them before they left, handing over thick envelopes that Eleanor suspected contained money. She had told no one what she had observed. The other servants did not want to know. They wanted to do their work, collect their wages, and go home to their families without becoming entangled in the affairs of their betters. Eleanor understood this instinct. She shared it, but the weight of what she knew had grown heavier over the years, pressing on her chest like a stone. The morning that Thomas Ashworth visited Harland House, Eleanor was polishing the banister of the main staircase. She saw him enter, this young solicitor with his worn coat and his nervous eyes, and she saw him led up to Theodore's study. She heard the door close. And then, because she had learned to be invisible, she crept up the stairs and stood in the corridor outside the study, listening to voices that filtered through the heavy oak. She heard Theodore's smooth voice and the solicitor's quiet replies. She heard the offer of money and the threat that followed. She heard the solicitor ask for time to consider, and she heard Theodore's cold agreement, and she understood that this young man, this Thomas Ashworth, had discovered something that Theodore needed to hide, something important enough to warrant both bribery and blackmail. When Thomas emerged from the study, Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, making herself small and still. He walked past her without seeing her, his face pale, his hands trembling. She watched him descend the staircase and cross the marble floor and step out through the front door into the cold morning light, and she made a decision that would change the course of her life. That evening, after her duties were complete, Eleanor walked to Chancery Lane. She found the building where Thomas Ashworth worked, a narrow structure squeezed between a bookshop and a tailor. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where a sign on a door read, "Blackwood and Associates, Solicitors." The office was dark, but a light burned in a window at the back. Eleanor knocked. Thomas opened the door. He looked surprised to see her, this plain young woman in a servant's dress, standing in the doorway of his office after business hours. "Can I help you?" he asked. My name is Eleanor Whitmore," she said. I work at Harland House, and I know things about Theodore Harland that you need to hear." They sat in Thomas's cramped office, the door closed, the candles burning low. Eleanor spoke, and Thomas listened, his face growing more troubled with each revelation. She told him about the locked room and the late-night visitors. She told him about the envelopes of money and the coded conversations. She told him about the look in Theodore's eyes, that cold hunger that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. "There is something wrong with him," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady but soft, the voice of someone who had learned to speak without being heard. "I have watched him for 7 years. I have seen how he treats people, how he manipulates them, how he discards them when they are no longer useful. He is not simply a wealthy man protecting his fortune. He is something else, something worse." Thomas leaned back in his chair. His mind was racing, trying to fit this new information together with what he had discovered in the ledgers, the financial irregularities, the secret transfers, the hidden accounts. These were crimes, certainly, but they were comprehensible crimes motivated by greed or desperation. What Eleanor was describing was different. It suggested something deeper, some fundamental disorder in Theodore Harland's character that went beyond ordinary corruption. "The visitors," Thomas said slowly. "The ones who come at night. Do you know who they are?" Eleanor shook her head. "I have never seen their faces clearly, but I have heard names mentioned. Dr. Pemberton, Mr. Crane, a woman called Mrs. Shaw." She paused. "And there is another name that Theodore uses when he thinks no one is listening. He speaks of someone called the Judge." Thomas felt a cold sensation spread through his chest. "A judge? Do you know which one?" "No, but I know that Theodore speaks of him with something like fear. Not respect. Fear." Eleanor looked at Thomas with her quiet, observant eyes. "Whatever Theodore is doing, whatever these people are helping him to hide, it is connected to this judge. I am certain of it." Thomas sat in silence for a long moment, thinking. The pattern was becoming clearer now, though its full shape remained hidden. Theodore Harland was not merely stealing money from his bank's clients. He was building something, a network of influence and obligation that extended into the highest levels of society. The nocturnal visitors, the secret payments, the coded conversations. These were the threads of a web, and Theodore sat at its center like a patient spider. "Why are you telling me this?" Thomas asked finally. "You could lose your position. You could lose far more than that if Theodore discovers what you have done." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I cannot carry this knowledge alone any longer. Because I have watched him destroy people, good people, people who trusted him, or crossed him, or simply stood in his way. Because my sister worked in this house before me and she left suddenly 5 years ago and I have not heard from her since." Her voice did not waver, but her hands tightened in her lap. "I believe Theodore did something to her. I cannot prove it, but I believe it." Thomas looked at this young woman, this servant who had spent 7 years watching and waiting and carrying her terrible knowledge in silence. He thought about the choice that lay before him, the bribe he could accept, the threats he could bow to, the comfortable obscurity he could retreat into. And he thought about his father, who had died in debt but had never compromised his principles, who had taught Thomas that some things mattered more than survival. "I will not take his money," Thomas said, "and I will not be silenced, but I cannot fight him alone. And neither can you. We need evidence. Real evidence. The kind that can be presented in court." "The locked room," Eleanor said immediately. "Whatever Theodore is hiding, it is in that room. I am certain of it." "Can you get access?" Eleanor hesitated. "Theodore keeps the key on his person at all times, but there is another way. The room has a window that opens onto a ledge. The ledge connects to a window in the adjacent corridor, a window that is sometimes left unlocked for ventilation." She looked at Thomas steadily. "It would be dangerous. If I were caught, I would be dismissed at best. At worst—" She did not finish the sentence. "I cannot ask you to take such a risk," Thomas said. "You are not asking. I am offering." Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts with practiced hands. "I will send word when I have something to report. In the meantime, continue your investigation. Find out who these people are. Dr. Pemberton, Mr. Crane, Mrs. Shaw, the judge. If we can understand what Theodore has built, perhaps we can find a way to bring it down. She left without another word, slipping out into the night as quietly as she had arrived. Thomas sat alone in his office, surrounded by his notebooks and his ledgers and the guttering candles, and he thought about what they were planning. They were two insignificant people, a junior solicitor and a parlourmaid, preparing to challenge one of the most powerful families in England. It was madness, it was suicide, it was the only thing he could do. Over the next 3 weeks, Thomas conducted the most careful investigation of his career. He worked during the day at his ordinary duties, reviewing contracts and drafting wills, and he worked at night on the Harland matter, tracing connections and gathering information with the patience of a man building a case that might never see the inside of a courtroom. Dr. Pemberton, he discovered, was a physician who specialized in nervous disorders. His practice catered to wealthy clients who wished to keep their ailments private, and he had a reputation for discretion that bordered on secrecy. Thomas found records of payments from the Harland accounts to Dr. Pemberton dating back more than 5 years, regular monthly payments that were listed in the ledgers as consulting fees, but which far exceeded normal medical expenses. Mr. Crane was more difficult to identify. The name was common, and it took Thomas nearly a week of searching before he found a connection. Edward Crane was a private inquiry agent, the kind of man who could discover anyone's secrets for the right price. He operated from an office in Soho, above a tobacconist, and he was known to have worked for several wealthy families who needed embarrassing information to disappear. Thomas did not approach him directly, but he noted the connection and added it to his growing file. Mrs. Shaw proved to be the most interesting discovery. She was the widow of a banker who had died under mysterious circumstances 10 years earlier, leaving behind a modest fortune and a reputation for knowing everyone worth knowing in London society. She hosted salons at her house in Belgravia, gatherings where politicians and businessmen and artists mingled freely, and it was whispered that information exchanged at her parties had influenced everything from parliamentary votes to stock prices. Thomas found no direct financial connection between Mrs. Shaw and the Harlands, but her name appeared in several letters that had been filed with the bank's correspondence, letters that discussed arrangements in language that was deliberately vague. The judge remained a mystery. Thomas searched court records and legal directories, looking for any judge who might have a connection to the Harland family. He found several possibilities: men who had ruled in favor of Harland interests in civil disputes or who had socialized with the family at public events. But none of them seemed significant enough to warrant the fear that Eleanor had described in Theodore's voice. Meanwhile, Eleanor sent messages through a complicated system of dead drops and intermediaries. She reported on Theodore's movements, his meetings, his moods. She noted when he visited the locked room and how long he stayed. She observed which servants he spoke to and which he avoided, which letters made him smile and which made him pace his study for hours. Slowly, a portrait emerged of a man under pressure, a man whose carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Theodore had always been meticulous about his appearance. Now he sometimes appeared at breakfast with his cravat askew or his hair uncombed. He had always been precise in his speech. Now he sometimes lost his train of thought in a mid-sentence, staring into space as if listening to voices that no one else could hear. He had always been controlled in his temper. Now he flew into rages over minor provocations, dismissing servants for spilling tea or burning toast. The family noticed. Theodore's mother, Lady Harland, had taken to her rooms and refused to come down for meals. His younger sister, Charlotte, had been sent to stay with relatives in the country. The household staff whispered among themselves about the young master's strange behavior, though they were careful to whisper only when they were certain no one could overhear. And then, on the 4th week, Eleanor sent a message that changed everything. She had found a way into the locked room. The night was cold and moonless, perfect for secrecy. Eleanor waited until the house was silent, until the last candle had been extinguished and the last footstep had faded, and then she crept from her small room in the servants' quarters to the 3rd-floor corridor. Her heart was beating so hard she was certain it could be heard throughout the house, but she forced herself to move slowly, carefully, placing each foot with deliberate precision. The corridor window was unlocked, as she had hoped. She opened it just enough to slip through, then stepped onto the narrow ledge that ran along the exterior of the house. The stone was cold beneath her bare feet, slick with moisture from the night air. Below her, the garden lay in darkness, a long drop that would mean death if she fell. She did not look down. The locked room's window was 10 feet away, along a ledge that was barely wide enough for her feet. Eleanor pressed her back against the wall and edged sideways, inch by inch, her fingers gripping the rough stone until they bled. The wind picked up, tugging at her nightdress, and she froze, waiting for it to pass. When it did, she continued, counting each step, refusing to think about what would happen if she slipped. The window was latched from the inside, but Eleanor had anticipated this. She pulled a thin blade from her pocket, a knife she had taken from the kitchen weeks earlier and had hidden in her mattress. She slid the blade between the window frames and worked it back and forth until she felt the latch give way. The window swung open. Eleanor climbed through and dropped silently onto the floor of Theodore Harland's private room. For a long moment she stood in darkness, letting her eyes adjust, listening for any sound that might indicate she had been heard. The house remained silent. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a candle and a box of matches, her hands trembling so badly that it took 3 attempts to strike a flame. The room was smaller than she had expected, perhaps 12 feet square. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with objects that made Eleanor's blood run cold. There were photographs, dozens of them, photographs of people she recognized, servants who had worked in the house and left, business associates of the Harland family, politicians and bankers and lawyers. Each photograph was labeled with a name and a date, and beside each photograph was a file containing pages of handwritten notes. Eleanor lifted one of the files at random. It concerned a man named William Fletcher, a member of Parliament who had voted against a railway bill that would have benefited Harland interests. The notes detailed Mr. Fletcher's habits, his movements, his weaknesses. They described his visits to a certain address in Whitechapel, visits that his wife and colleagues knew nothing about. They noted that Mr. Fletcher had changed his vote 3 weeks after these visits were documented, and that he had received a payment of £200 shortly thereafter. Eleanor replaced the file and reached for another. This one concerned a woman named Mary Collins, a servant who had worked in Harland House 6 years earlier. The notes described Mary as difficult and untrustworthy. They described an incident in which Mary had overheard a conversation she should not have heard, and they ended with a single sentence, written in Theodore's distinctive hand: "Problem resolved, March 14th, 1888. Eleanor's hands began to shake. She thought of her sister, who had left suddenly 5 years ago, who had never written, never visited, never sent word of where she had gone. She searched the shelves frantically, pulling down files, scanning names, until she found what she was looking for. The file was labeled Sarah Whitmore. It contained a photograph of Eleanor's sister, smiling, young, alive. It contained notes about Sarah's work in the house, her relationships with other servants, her knowledge of Theodore's activities, and it ended with the same terrible sentence: "Problem resolved, April 20th, 1889. Eleanor sank to the floor. She did not cry. The shock was too profound for tears. She simply sat there in the candlelight, holding the file that confirmed what she had always feared, what she had never allowed herself to believe. Her sister was dead. Theodore Harland had killed her, and he had kept a record of the killing, a trophy, a memento of his crime. She did not know how long she sat there. Minutes, perhaps, or hours. But eventually she forced herself to stand, to continue her search. If she was going to bring Theodore Harland to justice, she needed evidence that could be presented in court. The files were damning, but they were not proof. A clever lawyer could argue that they were fiction, the fantasies of a disturbed mind, nothing more than imaginative exercises. In the corner of the room, beneath a cloth that had been draped over it, Eleanor found a safe. It was a small iron box with a combination lock, the kind used to secure valuable documents. She tried several combinations without success, then noticed a pattern in the dust on the floor. Theodore had stood here often, shifting his weight as he worked the combination. The most worn spot was directly in front of the dial. Eleanor looked at the dial and saw that certain numbers were more faded than others from repeated use. She tried combinations using those numbers. On her 7th attempt, the lock clicked open. Inside the safe were 3 items. The first was a stack of letters bound with a ribbon, written in a hand that Eleanor did not recognize. The second was a leather journal, filled with entries in Theodore's handwriting, entries that appeared to describe his thoughts and feelings in disturbingly intimate detail. The third was a sealed envelope addressed to Judge Harold Pemberton. Eleanor took all 3 items. She closed the safe, replaced the cloth, and returned everything else to its original position. Then she extinguished her candle, climbed back out the window, and made her way along the ledge to the corridor. By the time she reached her room, dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. She did not sleep. She sat on her narrow bed, holding her sister's file, and waited for the day when she could deliver what she had found to Thomas Ashworth. Thomas read Theodore Harland's journal in a single sitting, unable to stop, unable to look away. It was a document unlike anything he had ever encountered, a window into a mind that was brilliant and broken in equal measure. Theodore had begun the journal when he was 18 years old, and he had continued it faithfully for nearly a decade, recording his thoughts and plans and obsessions with the precision of a naturalist documenting a new species. The early entries were unremarkable, the writings of a privileged young man who believed himself destined for greatness. Theodore described his education at Oxford, his introduction to the family business, his first successful negotiations with clients and competitors. He wrote about his ambitions with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, certain that he would surpass his father and grandfather and build the Harland Empire into something unprecedented. But as the entries progressed, something changed. Theodore began to write about a feeling that had been growing inside him since childhood, a sense that other people were not quite real, that they existed only as obstacles or instruments in his pursuit of power. He described his first experiments in manipulation, small cruelties inflicted on servants and schoolmates, tests to see how much control he could exert over those around him. He noted their reactions with clinical detachment, analyzing their fear and confusion as if they were laboratory specimens. "They are all so weak," Theodore had written in an entry dated 1887. "They believe in things. Love, loyalty, honor. These are just words to me, sounds that people make to justify their submission to stronger wills. I have no such illusions. I see the world as it truly is, a battlefield where the ruthless triumph and the sentimental perish, and I intend to triumph." The journal documented Theodore's systematic corruption of everyone around him. He had identified the weaknesses of business associates and exploited them. He had gathered secrets about politicians and judges and used those secrets to bend them to his will. He had paid doctors to write false reports about his mental health, reports that certified him as perfectly sound when he knew himself to be anything but, and when people had threatened to expose him, he had dealt with them. The journal did not describe how. It simply noted that they had been dealt with, their names entered in a list that grew longer with each passing year. Thomas turned to the entries from the past 6 months. Here, Theodore's handwriting became erratic, the letters sometimes cramped and sometimes sprawling, as if written by different people at different times. The content was equally disturbed. Theodore wrote about voices that whispered to him at night, voices that told him he was losing control, that his enemies were closing in, that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. He wrote about his fear of the locked room, his fear of what he might do if the pressure became too great, and he wrote about his plan to escape. "I have placed everything in the hands of Judge Pemberton," Theodore had written in an entry dated just 3 weeks earlier. "He will protect me when the time comes. He must protect me. He owes me too much to do otherwise. If the solicitor continues his investigation, if Eleanor continues her watching, I will have no choice but to act. But I will not act alone. The judge will ensure that I am never held accountable. The judge will make it all disappear." Thomas set down the journal. His hands were trembling. He understood now the full extent of what they were facing. Theodore Harland was not merely corrupt. He was ill, profoundly ill, suffering from some disorder of the mind that had twisted his perception of reality and destroyed his capacity for empathy, and he had spent years building a network of complicity that reached into the highest levels of the legal system, a network designed to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Judge Harold Pemberton. Thomas recognized the name now. He was a senior judge in the Court of Chancery, responsible for ruling on matters of equity and trust. He had presided over several cases involving the Harland family, always ruling in their favor. Thomas had assumed these rulings reflected the strength of the Harland legal team. Now, he understood, they reflected something else entirely. The letters that Eleanor had found confirmed Thomas's suspicions. They were correspondence between Theodore and Judge Pemberton, stretching back more than 5 years. The early letters were businesslike, discussing investments and social engagements. But the later letters were different. They contained references to favors exchanged, debts owed, arrangements that must never be spoken of in public, and they contained something else, something that made Thomas's blood run cold. They contained instructions. Theodore had been preparing for the possibility that his crimes would be discovered. He had established accounts in foreign banks, accounts that could not be touched by English law. He had arranged for false identities, documents that would allow him to disappear and start again in another country. And he had secured Judge Pemberton's promise to assist in this escape, to quash any investigation before it could reach a court, to ensure that Theodore Harland would never face justice. The sealed envelope addressed to Judge Pemberton contained the details of this arrangement. It was Theodore's insurance policy, a document that implicated the judge so thoroughly in his crimes that Pemberton would have no choice but to help him. Thomas read it carefully, noting the specific accusations, the dates, the amounts of money that had changed hands. It was enough. It was finally enough. Thomas knew that he could not take this evidence to the regular authorities. Judge Pemberton's influence extended throughout the legal system, and any investigation conducted through normal channels would be quietly suppressed. He needed to go higher, to someone whose position placed them beyond Pemberton's reach. After careful consideration, he wrote a letter to Sir Charles Russell, the Attorney General, requesting a private meeting to discuss a matter of the utmost importance. The meeting was arranged for the following week at a private club in Westminster. Thomas spent the intervening days preparing his case, organizing the evidence into a clear and compelling narrative. He knew he would have only one chance to convince the Attorney General that his accusations were genuine. If he failed, Theodore Harland would learn of the attempt and Thomas would face the consequences. But Theodore moved first. On the morning before the scheduled meeting, Thomas arrived at his office to find it ransacked. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers had been pulled from desks, files had been torn apart, his notebooks were gone, his copies of the ledgers were gone. Everything he had gathered over weeks of careful investigation had been taken or destroyed. Standing in the doorway, watching Thomas survey the destruction, was Theodore Harland. "You should have taken my offer," Theodore said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, but his eyes had changed since their last meeting. There was something wild in them now, something barely controlled. "I gave you a chance to walk away. I gave you £500 and the promise of a future, but you were stubborn. You were righteous." He stepped into the office, his shoes crunching on scattered papers. "And now, you have nothing." Thomas stood his ground. His heart was racing, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You're wrong," he said. "The evidence you took from this office was only copies. The originals are in a safe place, along with additional materials that you don't even know exist. Your journal, your letters to Judge Pemberton, the files you keep in your locked room, documenting everyone you've destroyed." And Theodore's face went pale. For a moment, the mask slipped completely, and Thomas saw the fear beneath it, the desperate terror of a man who had spent his entire life controlling everything around him and was now watching that control slip away. Then the mask returned, but it was no longer perfect. Cracks were visible. "You're lying," Theodore said. "No one has access to that room. The key never leaves my possession." "The key doesn't matter when there's a window." Thomas watched Theodore's face as the implications registered. "Your servants see more than you think. They hear more. They remember more, and some of them have been waiting a very long time for the chance to hold you accountable. Theodore began to pace. His movements were jerky, agitated, nothing like the smooth grace he had displayed at their first meeting. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. "You think you're exposing a criminal. You think you're bringing a villain to justice, but you don't understand. You can't understand. I am the only thing holding this family together. I am the only one who sees clearly. Without me, everything will collapse." "Your family will survive," Thomas said. "They survived before you came of age, and they'll survive after you're gone. But the people you've hurt will finally have justice. The servants you've dismissed and destroyed, the business associates you've blackmailed." Mary Collins. Sarah Whitmore. He paused, watching Theodore flinch at the names. "You kept records of your crimes because you couldn't resist. You wanted trophies, mementos, proof of your power, and now those records will destroy you." Theodore stopped pacing. He stood, very still, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing shallow and rapid. "I could kill you right now," he said quietly. "I could close that door and put my hands around your throat and squeeze until you stopped breathing. No one would know, no one would care. Another problem resolved." "You could try," Thomas said, "but it wouldn't save you. The evidence has already been delivered. By the time you dispose of my body, the Attorney General will have everything he needs. Judge Pemberton will be arrested. Your escape routes will be closed, and you will face the full weight of English law for the first time in your life." The silence stretched between them. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the sweat on his palms. He had gambled everything on this confrontation, counting on Theodore's need to understand, to explain, to have the last word. If he was wrong, if Theodore simply acted on his murderous impulse, then all of this would have been for nothing. But Theodore did not move. Instead, something seemed to break inside him. His shoulders slumped, his clenched hands relaxed. The wildness in his eyes faded, replaced by something that might have been exhaustion or might have been despair. "You don't know what it's like," he said softly. "Living inside my head, knowing that nothing is real except power, knowing that people are just things to be used and discarded. I didn't choose this, I didn't want this, but it's all I have. It's all I am." He looked at Thomas with something approaching genuine emotion. "Do you think I enjoy being this way? Do you think I wanted to become a monster?" Thomas did not answer. He had no answer to give. Theodore Harland was a puzzle he could not solve, a man whose inner workings were as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. All he knew was that Theodore had caused tremendous harm, and that harm demanded accountability. "It's over, Theodore," Thomas said finally. "Whatever happens next, this part is over." Theodore nodded slowly, then he turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Thomas stood alone amid the scattered papers, waiting for his hands to stop shaking, waiting for his heart to slow. He had won. Against all odds, he had won. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge of what Theodore had revealed, the glimpse of a mind so damaged that it could not even recognize its own destruction. The private inquiry was convened 2 weeks later in a chamber of the Inns of Court reserved for matters of extreme sensitivity. The presiding official was Sir James Hannon, a retired judge of impeccable reputation who had been brought out of retirement specifically for this case. The audience consisted of representatives from the Attorney General's office, senior officials from the Bank of England, and a small group of legal observers sworn to absolute secrecy. Thomas presented his evidence methodically, building his case piece by piece. He showed the ledgers documenting the irregular transfers. He read excerpts from Theodore's journal, omitting nothing, sparing no detail. He produced the correspondence, with Judge Pemberton, and the files from the locked room, each one a brick in the wall of accusation that was rising around Theodore Harland. Theodore sat in a chair at the front of the chamber, flanked by lawyers who had been retained at enormous expense. He listened to the testimony without visible reaction, his face as composed as a mask, but those who looked closely could see the cracks. His right hand trembled slightly when certain documents were mentioned. His jaw tightened when Thomas described the fate of Mary Collins and Sarah Whitmore. And his eyes, those cold, pale eyes, had taken on a distant quality, as if he were not entirely present in the room. Eleanor testified on the second day. She described her 7 years of observation, the patterns she had noticed, the fears she had carried. She spoke of her sister, her voice steady, despite the grief that lay beneath her words. And she described her entry into the locked room, the photographs on the shelves, the files that documented Theodore's systematic destruction of anyone who stood in his way. Judge Pemberton had been arrested the previous week. He had attempted to flee to France, but had been detained at Dover, his bags full of documents and cash. Now he sat in custody, awaiting his own inquiry, his reputation destroyed, his career ended. His testimony would be taken separately, under conditions that ensured he could not communicate with Theodore or coordinate their stories. On the third day, Theodore was called to give his own account. His lawyers had advised him to remain silent, to offer nothing that could be used against him. But Theodore had insisted on speaking. He needed to speak. The compulsion was visible in every line of his body as he rose from his chair and approached the witness stand. What followed was unlike anything Thomas had expected. Theodore began calmly enough, denying the accusations, explaining away the evidence, offering alternative interpretations for the documents that had been presented. But as the questioning continued, something began to shift. His answers became longer, more elaborate, more detached from the questions being asked. He spoke of his childhood, his education, his vision for the Harland Empire. He spoke of the voices that had guided him, the certainties that had sustained him. He spoke of the necessity of his actions, the weakness of those who opposed him, the inevitability of his triumph. Sir James Hannan listened with growing concern. The lawyers exchanged glances. The observers shifted in their seats. Thomas watched Theodore's mask dissolve completely, revealing the broken mind beneath. "You ask me if I regret what I have done," Theodore said, his voice rising. "Regret is for the weak. Regret is for those who cannot see the truth. I have done what was necessary. I have removed obstacles. I have protected my family. I have preserved our legacy." He turned to face the chamber, his eyes wild, his hands gesturing. "And you sit here in judgment of me. You who have never had the courage to do what must be done. You who hide behind your laws and your procedures and your pathetic morality." "Mr. Harland," Sir James said firmly, "you will control yourself." Theodore turned to the judge. For a long moment he stared at the elderly man, and something in his expression changed. The wildness faded. In its place was something colder, something calculating, something that Thomas recognized from their very first meeting. "I will not be judged by you," Theodore said quietly. "I will not be judged by anyone." He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope. "This contains £5,000. It is yours if you adjourn this inquiry indefinitely and rule that the evidence presented is insufficient for prosecution." The chamber fell silent. Sir James Hannan stared at Theodore with an expression of profound shock. The lawyers froze. The observers held their breath. "Mr. Harland," Sir James said slowly, "you're attempting to bribe a judicial official in open court. This is a criminal act. Do you understand what you have done?" Theodore smiled. It was not the controlled smile of their first meeting, not the calculated expression of a man playing a role. It was something else entirely, something unhinged, something that spoke of a mind finally slipping its moorings. "I understand perfectly," he said. "I understand that money has always bought me what I needed. I understand that everyone has a price. I understand that I am Theodore Harland, and Theodore Harland cannot be held accountable by ordinary men." He looked around the chamber, his smile widening. "My father taught me that. My grandfather taught me that. 3 generations of wealth have taught me that there is no law that cannot be circumvented, no judge who cannot be purchased, no consequence that cannot be avoided." He held out the envelope towards Sir James. "So name your price, old man. Everyone has a price." Sir James Hannan rose from his seat. His face was flushed with anger, but his voice remained steady. Theodore Harland, you are hereby remanded into custody pending a full criminal trial. The charges against you now include attempted bribery of a judicial official in addition to all previous accusations. This inquiry is concluded." He turned to the guards at the door. "Take him." The guards moved forward. Theodore did not resist. He stood perfectly still as they approached, the envelope still in his outstretched hand, the smile still on his face. But something had broken behind his eyes. The certainty that had sustained him for so many years, the belief in his own invincibility, had finally cracked, and through that crack, the full weight of reality came, flooding in. "No," Theodore whispered. "No, this isn't right. This can't happen. I am Theodore Harland. I am—" His voice broke. He began to tremble, his whole body shaking. "I am Theodore Harland. Theodore Harland. Theodore—" He collapsed to the floor, the envelope falling from his fingers, his words dissolving into incoherent sounds. The guards carried him out. Thomas watched them go, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound weariness. The man who had terrorized so many, who had killed and corrupted and destroyed without remorse, was now reduced to a trembling wreck, broken not by law or justice, but by the failure of his own delusions. It was not the ending Thomas had imagined. It was not the ending anyone had imagined, but it was an ending, and that would have to be enough. The trial of Theodore Harland never took place. 3 days after the private inquiry, he was transferred to an asylum for the criminally insane, where physicians determined that he was unfit to stand trial. The diagnosis was mania, complicated by moral insanity, a condition that rendered him incapable of understanding the nature of his crimes or participating in his own defense. He would spend the rest of his life in that institution, confined to a private wing paid for by what remained of the family fortune. Judge Harold Pemberton was less fortunate. His trial proceeded in the spring of 1895, and he was convicted on multiple counts of corruption, bribery, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and stripped of all honors and titles. He died in his cell 2 years later of what the prison physician recorded as heart failure, but what others whispered was shame. The Harland Bank survived, though not in its original form. The irregularities in the accounts were traced and corrected, the stolen funds recovered where possible and written off where not. A new board of directors was appointed, composed of men who had no connection to Theodore or his schemes. The family name was preserved, but the family itself withdrew from public life, retreating to country estates where they could escape the whispers and the stares. Eleanor Whitmore left service. The publicity surrounding the case had made her famous in certain circles, and she used that fame to advocate for the rights of domestic workers, speaking at meetings and writing letters to newspapers. She never married. She never found closure for her sister's death, though the files confirmed what had happened and where Sarah's remains had been buried. She visited the grave every year on the anniversary, leaving flowers that wilted in the wind. Thomas Ashworth's career flourished, though not in the way he had expected. His role in exposing the Harland scandal brought him attention from clients who valued integrity over connections, and he eventually established his own practice, specializing in cases involving financial irregularities and abuse of power. He never became wealthy, never achieved the heights that ambitious lawyers dreamed of, but he built a reputation for honesty that proved more durable than any fortune. He thought often about Theodore Harland, about the man he had met in that study overlooking the gardens, the man who had offered him money and threatened him with ruin. He thought about the journal entries, the descent into madness documented in Theodore's own hand. He thought about what creates such a mind, what combination of privilege and isolation and unchecked power could produce a person so fundamentally broken that he could not recognize his own monstrosity. There were no easy answers. Theodore had been born into wealth that insulated him from consequences. He had been raised to believe that his desires were more important than other people's lives. He had been given power without wisdom, influence without empathy, control without compassion. Perhaps the seeds of his destruction had been planted long before he was born in generations of Harlands who had taught their children that money could buy anything, that rules were for lesser people, that family was the only loyalty that mattered. Or perhaps Theodore had simply been different from the start, a mind that developed without the capacity for conscience, a soul that never learned to see others as fully human. Perhaps all the wealth and privilege had done was give him the resources to act on impulses that would have been restrained in a man of ordinary means. Perhaps he would have been a monster, regardless of his circumstances. Just a less dangerous one. Thomas did not know. He doubted anyone knew. Theodore Harland remained a mystery even to the physicians who treated him, even to himself. The man who had once controlled so much could no longer control his own thoughts, lost in delusions that grew more elaborate with each passing year. He believed himself to be the true ruler of England, kept prisoner by conspirators who feared his power. He believed his family would rescue him any day, would restore him to his rightful place. He believed that Thomas Ashworth was a demon sent to test him, and that if he resisted long enough, he would be rewarded with everything he had ever wanted. In the end, Theodore Harland was destroyed not by law or justice, but by the very qualities that had made him powerful. His certainty became delusion, his control became obsession, his wealth became a prison from which he could not escape. He had spent his life manipulating others, and in the end, his own mind turned against him, creating a reality that no amount of money could alter. The locked room on the third floor of Harland House was emptied after the inquiry. The photographs were taken as evidence, though most could not be connected to specific crimes. The files were archived in a government repository, where they would remain sealed for 100 years. The journal was kept by Thomas, who read it occasionally when he needed to remind himself why his work mattered, why the slow and careful pursuit of justice was worth the sacrifice it demanded. Years later, when Thomas was an old man himself, he would sometimes walk past Harland House on his way to his office. The house had been sold, converted into offices for a respectable insurance company. The gardens were maintained by professional landscapers. The blood-red door had been painted a sensible grey. Nothing remained of the family that had built it, that had filled it with secrets and crimes and the slow poison of unchecked privilege. Thomas would pause sometimes, looking up at the windows, remembering the young man he had been when he first climbed those steps. He had been afraid then, uncertain of himself and his place in the world. He had faced a choice between his principles and his survival, and he had chosen principles, not knowing if he would survive the decision. He had survived. That was the lesson he carried with him through all the years that followed. The powerful were not invincible. The wealthy were not untouchable. Money could buy many things, but it could not buy everything. There were limits, even for those who believed themselves beyond limitation. Consequences, even for those who had never faced consequences before. Theodore Harland had learned that lesson too late. He had tried to buy his way out of madness, to purchase sanity, as he had purchased everything else in his life. But some things cannot be bought. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. Some paths, once taken, lead only to destruction. The Victorian heir who had believed himself destined for greatness ended his days in a small room with barred windows, attended by nurses who did not know his name, forgotten by a world that had once trembled at his power. His fortune was dispersed, his legacy erased, his name spoken only in whispers by historians studying the darker corners of the age. And Thomas Ashworth, the junior solicitor who had refused to be silenced, who had chosen integrity over survival, lived to see a new century dawn, carrying with him the knowledge that even the smallest of us can bring down the mightiest, if only we have the courage to try.